Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. As a fair warning, this video is going to be very different from my normal content. We're going to talk about things like design philosophy, game balance, and other boring nerd stuff that I imagine few people really care about. This is also going to be somewhat poorly structured and very rambly, so if you watch my streams you kinda know what you're in for. Considering the discussion spurred by Trib and, to a lesser degree, Sab's videos about the topic of crowd control, I want to talk about it and its current state. The trend will probably be old by the time this is out, but hey, add it to the pile, I guess. I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, actually, but the problem has just grown and grown to the point that I feel like I've only gotten more and more certain of my position. I do ask at the least that you watch this video through before commenting, as there's a good chance I'll bring up a criticism you may have later down the line. This one is going to be long, I know it's kind of a tall order, but hopefully I'll save you the effort if I answer your question up front. This might not be as visually stimulating as my typical content, so for those of you who just listen to my videos, know that you are seen. Because I'm certainly not seen by all of you. Speaking of those two videos, I'll leave them both in the description for you to watch. I do disagree with them on a few things, but overall find them both to be very good and worth a watch if you want more perspectives on this topic. This video does not serve as a reply to either of those videos, but certain ideas are inspired by them, so I want you all to give them a watch if you've got the care. I also want to make it clear this video isn't made with the intention to clown on DE or trash them for being incompetent or anything like that. I find it's really bold to assume that I could easily do their job better than them, which most of the community does seem to think about themselves if I'm honest. But as somebody who's put nearly a calendar year of hours into this game, I do feel that I at least have more understanding on the topic than the average player. Considering that we're talking about crowd control so much, I want to first give a quick definition for what it is. In a nutshell, crowd control, or CC for short, is the blanket term for effects and abilities that limit enemies, whether that be movement, damage potential, or special abilities, without outright killing them. Things like slows, staggers, stuns, blinds, knockdowns, confusion, disarmament, paralysis effects like sleeping, you probably get the idea. The goal of most CC effects is to create breathing room by limiting what enemies can do, which results in a boost to survivability as well as opening them up to damage. I want to make it clear that CC isn't necessarily an alternative to damage, but more of a complement to it, making things more manageable so damage can be applied with relative ease and safety. After all, it's easier to kill things when they aren't trying to kill you and aren't moving either. CC is ultimately just that. It gets crowds under control, though it often does have some other benefits tied into it in order to make it more appealing. For example, Radio Blind opens enemies to finishers, and Bastille removes armor. These sort of dual-purpose abilities are really valuable, both because they CC these enemies and because they open up new ways to deal with them permanently. Even so, only locking down enemies is still valuable in its own right, as it reduces the pressure applied on you and your team by making the game not a bullet hell, and it also opens up opportunities to deal with threats now that they're sitting ducks. Alright, with all of that explanation out of the way, I do want to put one more thing out there regarding this whole community discourse. Crowd control is not worthless. I feel like so much of the community sentiment at the moment is that CC just does nothing, and that's absolutely not true. Crowd control isn't as viable as straight up killing everything, and that's due to a variety of factors, but it's not completely ineffective. With the Dante Unbound update, several abilities got added to the list of things that Overguard resists, and so many comments on the topic were about how CC is really dead now. And like, guys, not every unit has Overguard. Normally. This is at the very least consistent with the design philosophy of Overguard, even if it took 2 years to change. Most enemies are still affected by these abilities, counter units aren't the only thing you ever go up against, and it's honestly a very narrow-minded view of things to act like CC is completely purposeless. It absolutely has issues, don't get me wrong, but it can do its job pretty effectively in the right circumstances. Hell, grouping abilities are so valuable that they're often popular to subsume onto other characters, even though they're also limited by the same things as other forms of CC. Even so, there are circumstances where crowd control isn't very effective, like Defense or ESO where it actively slows your progression, or other game modes where it doesn't have much impact like Exterminate or Capture. But there are plenty of modes where it is still useful. Mobile Defense, Interception, Excavation, Void Flood, Mirror Defense, Alchemy, Hijack, all of these game modes gel with it quite well. Damage is still better in nearly every case, yeah, because killing an enemy is better than disabling it briefly, but it still absolutely works. Now then, beyond that tangent, why are we talking about Overguard? Well, if I'm honest, this video is really about CC as a whole, so that diatribe was relevant. It's just that Overguard is the biggest offender of the principles that were supposed to make it balanced. So then, today we're going to explore how Overguard works, what it was supposed to do, how that vision has decayed over time, and how we can fix it, with plenty of tangentially related topics explored along the way. Hopefully by the end of this video, I'll have made it clear why I wholeheartedly believe that DE doesn't understand Overguard. To dive into the problem deeper, let's explain the Overguard mechanic. Overguard is an extra layer of health on top of normal health and shields that both enemies and players can utilize. The player iteration isn't important for our discussion, but when an enemy possesses it, they're immune to almost all crowd control abilities and effects, and have a cap of 4 cold procs. To be more specific, they're immune to stuff like slows, blinds, sleeping, freezing, petrification, vitrification, staggers and stuns, being lifted or ragdolled, being knocked down, being disarmed, confusion effects like radiation and chaos, mind controls like enthrall and accuse, being terrified, being placed in stasis. I'm sure you get the picture by now. I want to make it clear this blocks crowd control, not debuffs. Most abilities with a CC and debuff component will still have the debuff part apply, like Avalanche's Armor Strip or Sentient Wrath's damage vulnerability, but there are weird exceptions to this rule, like Molecular Prime's, damage vulnerability. Would be kinda nice if these got a consistency pass too. Once an enemy's Overguard is removed with enough damage, they'll be affected by these crowd control effects like normal, though only if it's cast after the Overguard is removed, or if it's an aura that is still in effect, like Chaos Sphere or Gloom. Overguard is typically only seen on units with some kind of special ability, like Eximus, Thrax, and the Kuva Tricarian. Certain heavier units, like the Nox and Dax Malleus, also possess Overguard. This leads us into a question that I think a lot of people don't dig deep enough into. What exactly is the purpose of Overguard? In Trib's video, he says that counter mobs are to alter the way you play, but I feel like that's kind of a shallow view of it. Why alter the way the player approaches these mobs? In the case of Overguard, is it because crowd control was too strong? Well, no, it was already falling behind before the Angels of the Zeramin update, which introduced the mechanic. Though a sizable amount of the Warframe community still thinks that Overguard was a deliberate CC nerf after almost 2 years. So then, if not those things, what is the purpose of Overguard? It's actually pretty simple if you look at the pattern outlined with my previous examples. It's to force you to contend with enemies' unique mechanics.
Oh, I think we have an Eximus, which I'll quickly make short work of. But one important thing with the Eximus change, which is also coming in this update, is we're giving them a over health bar, which means that you will need, oh god, I'm being frozen. You will need to penetrate the over health bar before you can break through to their actual health bar. At this level, it doesn't really matter because, like I said, I'm over leveled. But that's just to try and increase the reason to engage with them by pumping them with DPS before you can get off, most of your kit. It's just an over health level, essentially.
Yeah, we're calling it protection.
Enemies were too easy to shut down without Overguard, being CC'd so hard you would never notice their new special attacks. So Overguard was put in place to prevent this until you had actually engaged in combat with the enemy, forcing you to deal with their abilities. Honestly, I totally get this intention, though whether or not you agree with it will vary. Each Eximus unit does have a specific method to countering them, though some more than others, as do the Tricarians and Thrax. The heavier units, being the Malleus and Nox, I assume are to make them feel like big dudes who are much more threatening than the average enemy, but they both have counters to their Overguard. Breaking a Nox's glass faceplate removes it all instantly, and the Malleus can still be knocked down if shot during their slam. Why is this at all relevant? Well, because these enemies are normally not that common. Eximus units are actually capped under normal circumstances in terms of spawns, scaling up with squad size. This means that, while you can't CC them out of the gate, you can CC all other units in order to focus on them. This still applies to scenarios with other overguarded units, where even if you have a few things that are immune, that immunity is temporary if you can break through the overguard, and normal chaff units will still be crowd controlled. Okay, that's all fine and dandy, but I'm going to be honest with you. This is an idealized version of how this mechanic works. Now we get into the promise of the title, DE breaking these rules over and over and over again, all in the name of difficulty. Overguard already has issues you might have noticed, one of them being that it completely shuts down crowd control instead of granting any sort of interesting interaction, which means that CC abilities are genuinely worthless when they connect with an overguarded enemy. Another major issue is that it's still an extra layer of health, and oftentimes enemies get so much of it that relatively high damage is required to chew through it all, meaning that CCing the unit after they've been stripped isn't as important because you needed high damage to get to that point regardless. These two core issues are going to be the main reason why Overguard spam is so bad. It shuts down CC entirely and promotes even more damage power use, both of which scale the total number of playstyles that can be effectively used in higher difficulty content. So, let's get into the chronological progression of Overguard since its addition, and how it's been broadened more and more over time, violating its own core rules while retaining and even exaggerating these major flaws. To start, there's one major source of Overguard I haven't brought up, being the Ancient Healer and their sister enemy, the Corrupted Ancient. These guys are interesting because they're a very powerful enemy in concept, but rarely noticeable in practice. How they work is that they give Overguard to nearby allies equal to 9 times the healer's own health until the healer dies, but they don't gain any Overguard themselves. This can be difficult for CC frames to deal with because healers are rather common support units, so at any given time about half the room is, in theory, immune to crowd control. Punching through the Overguard isn't that hard, but at that point you may as well just kill the enemy because the infested are so weak. Enemies under the effects of CC abilities will also be freed from those abilities' effects if a healer grants them Overguard, which especially sucks for Gaze and Corrupted missions. There is a huge Achilles heel for these guys though, being that units can only receive the Overguard once, so if it's destroyed or they leave and re-enter the radius of any healer, they can't get it back. This is really helpful as it means anything that strays too far from the healer can't be affected by it again, but then that leads us to a new problem. If units aren't staying near the healer for long, then it may as well not even exist. It seems that the quantity of healers goes up over time in endless missions, so the issues with their design are exacerbated the longer you're in a mission as it becomes harder for enemies to leave their effect radius, but it kind of makes them feel like a tile-dependent enemy in that regard. In cramped spaces, they're rather effective, while in open ones, they're not that noticeable. I will say that regardless of that fact, healers clearing CC effects like Gaze is still cancer. Radiation can counter them, as it does break the link between support units like the healer and their entourage, but it doesn't even matter if the room is big enough. And, you know, radiation has a bad matchup against infested. I know some of you might ask, well, what about the Severed Warden? And honestly, I find them much less offensive. They affect a very limited quantity of enemies, clearly telegraph who they're linked to, and can have their arms individually severed to reduce how much Overguard they can spread, all on top of being rarer than healers. They also, actually work consistently. Should a support unit that grants allies Overguard even exist, considering the purpose of Overguard to begin with? Maybe, maybe not, but if any enemy gets close to doing it well, it's the Warden. To summarize my thoughts, Ancient Healers aren't that big of a threat in practice, implying you're not in a cramped space or late in the mission, but I find that's due to flawed design making them inconsistent. Regardless of how they play out in mission though, I find that conceptually they are big offenders of both the scarcity principle that makes Overguard balanced, and the ability principle that justifies possessing it, even if their implementation is shoddy at best. Now, healers have been like this since Angels came out, and at first Eximus units actually had no spawn limit. This led to funny nonsense at level cap, because it used to be that as level increased more Eximus units would spawn, but they capped it and really solidified things in my view. Overguard is an uncommon attribute that forces you to engage in combat with special units, but CC still works against chaff, so you can take said special units down more easily. Healers violated this principle out of the gate, and were never scaled back to fit this new perspective, but DE would soon come to just not give a fuck about keeping Eximus units scarce either. Some of you probably think I'm gonna go straight to Eximus Stronghold sorties, but I actually kinda like those. I know this is weird, but the level is low enough that the chaos is both manageable and fun in my opinion. The Eximus unit spawn cap is set to 5 for all squad sizes and sortie endless missions though, which is kinda weird. Regardless, where things really start to get absurd is Duviri, and more specifically, the Steel Path Undercroft portals. Well, that's what I planned to talk about, but weirdly enough, it seems that my complaints got stealth changed sometime recently. To add some context, when in a Duviri experience run, 3 Undercroft portals around the map are chosen from a selection of possible spawns. These can be entered once 7 decrees have been obtained, and grant a random Duviri arcane when on the Steel Path, as well as a rare decree and 2 Steel Essence. In order to make these more challenging, the base enemy level is increased to 200, and of course, Steel Path modifiers are in play. On release, DE also decided that in the name of difficulty, Eximus units would be more common. This used to be very annoying to deal with, but lately it seems to have been hugely dialed back, though I can find nothing in any update notes about this. This is honestly a really great thing, though I am a bit nervous that it's a bug considering its lack of paper trail. My big guess is that the Steel Path specific effects such as this may be broken at the moment, but I really can't say for sure. One particular game mode does still suffer from this though, that being Undercroft Defense. Around the same time that these portals were added, they also reworked the Undercroft Defense missions to be 3 waves instead of 5. However, to compensate for this, they added a batch of Eximus units at the end of each wave for, again, higher difficulty and challenge. Well, this both hurts CC and defense even worse, as if it wasn't already struggling there, and it also makes things much harder to manage just in general. Making things even worse, the number of Eximus units and how early they can spawn increases the further you get in waves, and while it's not as bad as when it's stacked with the side objective spawn increase, it's still pretty absurd. By the final wave, I'd say something like 30% of all enemies in play are Eximus units, which feels very excessive when compared to normal gameplay. While it used to be much worse, closer to like 70%, it still feels like if you can't shut down the most dangerous Eximus units immediately, they're going to overwhelm you. You can stock up on a lot of decrees to offset this, but even so, the other game modes present in the Undercroft don't suffer from this issue nearly this much. Exacerbating this issue is the nature of defense as a game type. Enemies converge on a central point in large numbers, causing Eximus units to bolster each other's effectiveness to an absurd degree because they're all so close. Sometimes it can be pretty much impossible to play into these design counters because the effects overlap so much. Eximus units all have mechanics that require specific counterplay, so having a ton at once can make them almost entirely unmanageable if they stack up. Under normal circumstances, I actually like Eximus units. They have fun mechanics, mostly, and explode into health and energy when I kill them. But at this number and in this concentration, it becomes way more difficult to deal with, and not in a way that's fun. This does make the game harder, sure, but Eximus units are balanced in part by their rarity. This decision means that the number of overguarded enemies present at any given time is increased, especially with the presence of corrupted ancients, Malleus, and Thrax, so CC is less impactful as more enemies are immune to it. This all being on top of defense being arguably the least CC-friendly mode in the entire game, aside from maybe ESO. While I'm still uncertain if the Undercroft portal Eximus spawns being dialed back is intentional, I both really hope it is, and I also hope that Undercroft defense in particular gets a similar treatment. Despite the fact that Duviri seemed to finally get toned down, it honestly felt like DE then felt the need to double down. In the Intradi labs, the Netracells game mode has a chance to require that somebody take the Vanquisher keyglyph, which increases Eximus spawns to a level similar to the old Undercroft portals. I find this funny because normally keyglyphs are only supposed to affect the player who picks them up, but this one technically affects the whole squad. Maybe they could, add schizo Eximus units nobody else can see. The existence of this debuff is partially why I fear the Duviri portal changes aren't intentional, as I feel like DE must not have an issue with this quantity of Eximus if they keep bringing it back. Fast forward to Dante Unbound's release of Deep Archemedea, and this mechanic returns as a possible risk factor debuff, and while that furthers my bug concerns, there are 2 other possible debuffs that are brand new and that I find to be huge issues. The first is the Coordinated Front debuff in Assassination missions, which makes it so that the boss spawns Eximus units infinitely during their fight. I don't have a ton of footage of this as I was trying to, not die, but this should speak for itself. This is fucking ridiculous. Worse still, I also got the modifier that Guardian Eximus units could spawn, so most of the time they all had 90% damage reduction too. I was genuinely struggling to even see the goddamn boss, and on top of that, Eximus units with this modifier are almost always special units, like the Hollow Vein, Anatomizer, or Severed Warden. This means you're drowning in enemies that already have powerful special abilities, are now Eximus units, and are taking far less damage while being immune to crowd control. Hey, editing cool kid here. Quick thing to note because I worded this poorly, Guardians do provide 90% damage reduction to nearby allies, but this does not affect Overguard. So, is the Swarm of Eximus CC immune? Yes. Do they have 90% damage reduction from Guardians? Also yes, but not at the same time. Once the Overguard breaks, then the damage reduction kicks in. This doesn't solve the problem of special ability spam or drowning in so many enemies I can't even see, but it is important to clarify. Alright, back to me being upset in 3, 2, 1. I actually really like the fragmented bosses. I find them to be fun because they're normally very telegraphed and fair despite hitting hard, but this modifier totally trashes that. Normally Eximus units can spawn during this boss, but I actually find them useful because they drop health and energy while still being scarce. In this context, they are literally a wall of bodies between me and the boss. I cannot see his attacks. The one boss in the game that's actually clearly telegraphed, and I can't see him because I'm dodging 4 Blitz Blasts at once. Still fucking soloed it though, but even after all that, there's still another debuff that I find even more egregious. You see, if all of these increased spawns hurt CC's viability and make counterplay more difficult, there is still technically a measurable amount of enemies who are still able to be crowd controlled. Sure, CCing those isn't as valuable, as they aren't as numerous and are easy to kill, but it helps dampen the volume of lead being slung your way while you chew through the big stuff. Even if Eximus units spawn more often, even if healers grant allies Overguard, this doesn't go away. Some enemies will always be vulnerable right out of the gate. Well, DE decided this shouldn't be the case. Enter the Bolstered Belligerence debuff, which grants all enemy units in the mission 50% of their max health as Overguard.
What the fuck?
This completely violates every single principle put forward by Overguard's original premise, to force players to interact with special enemy mechanics and make heavier targets more of an immediate threat. This just completely shuts crowd control off, and in this implementation, absolutely it is just a straight up CC nerf. Why is this necessary? Because it's difficult? Yeah, it really is difficult fighting level 400 enemies who have boosted EHP and also can't be affected by half my frame's abilities. It's even worse because Deep Archemedea also makes you choose one of 3 random frames if you want the best rewards, so if they all rely on CC, you're just fucked. Get Loki, Limbo, and Neja? Sorry, tough luck, you're just gonna struggle like hell. Sure, they all still have mechanics that can help them succeed, but major sources of survivability gained from their crowd control is now completely worthless. Think this is unlikely? This literally happened to me the second week of Deep Archemedea's release. Even worse, Bolstered Belligerence appeared in Mirror Defense, which is normally one of the game's most CC-friendly modes, taking what could have been a fun interaction with my character's kit and turning it into a total nightmare. If anything can be taken from this video, it should at least be my perspective on examining developer intent when looking at additions and changes. Overguard was added with the original intent of making special enemy interactions and heavy units unable to be ignored. So what is the intent of this addition? I hate to say that genuinely, the only thing that I can come up with is the thing I was afraid of. DE thinks that more Overguard equals more difficulty, and they don't examine it beyond that. In a purely literal sense, yes, it absolutely does make the game more difficult, but not in a way that's fair or fun. When it comes to video games being hard, I feel like there are 2 major categories. Things being hard because they are mechanically difficult and require a lot of knowledge, which I'll call fair difficulty, or things that are hard because they strip options from the player or rely on random mechanics, which I'll call unfair difficulty. Bosses in Ultrakill are hard, but they have learnable attack patterns and demand a level of execution. Once you learn them, they're all very fair. Enemies in Helldivers 2 can randomly headshot or critically strike the player. These mechanics are entirely out of the player's control and, while they do make the game harder, they are decidedly unfair. Warframe even used to have the same crit and headshot mechanic, and removed it for that very reason. It's beyond the player's control, and that makes it feel bad when you die to it. What Overguard does, especially in this context, is remove options from the player for difficulty's sake. I don't know about you, but when my character is not able to interact with the mission in any meaningful way because I get a random modifier that locks me out of a massive list of abilities, it doesn't exactly feel very fair. Sure, it's harder, but it's not in any way fun and is entirely out of my control, especially with the random frame lineup you receive. Something else that makes these modifiers a bummer to me is that there are good modifiers for crowd control. Like, for example, Alchemical Invulnerability, where enemies in Alchemy gain elemental shields that make them immune to damage unless they're hit with a matching amphor. Thing is, they can be crowd controlled to stall them out until you can find one of a matching element. Or Vampiric Liminus, where 2 invincible Liminus enemies stalk the player, which drain health and energy if they're too close. However, they can still be crowd controlled, with certain abilities dispelling them completely. Okay, I can only hope that after 9 pages of script, I've made my argument clear here. Overguard is just seen as a blanket difficulty go-up mechanic by DE, and they've totally lost sight of its original purpose and the measures in place that made it conceptually balanced. I say conceptually because, even with all this considered, CC doing absolutely nothing to Overguard still isn't fun and has an effect I've thus far mostly neglected. It reinforces the existing meta of high damage powerhouses that ultimately lead to thoughtless and stale gameplay. It's funny because the effectiveness of damage actually kind of violates Overguard's intention by itself, as you can often deal with Eximus units so quickly they aren't ever a threat. While I don't think there is ever going to be a world where CC is better than damage, and I'll explain later why I don't actually think it should be, the game has demanded more and more that players rely on high damage. Disruption is a damage check, defense requires room clearing to progress, survival benefits from high kills per minute for life support, Cascade requires high damage on Thrax units, enemies will persist if not all of them are killed in Armageddon, ESO literally requires high kills per minute to progress. Adding more units immune to crowd control just makes the game interact less and less with characters built for it, and beyond that, newer characters are focusing more and more on reinforcing this gameplay climate rather than exploring other playstyles. A lot of people said they felt like Kullervo, Daggeth, and Corvex felt samey because they all have the same mechanics of kill enemies in a line, and while I don't think these are all the same character necessarily, I hate to say I kind of agree. Tell me, who was the last CC-focused frame we got? Not just one with a single CC ability, but one where it's a major part of their kit. There are honestly many ways to answer this question. If one power is just allowed, then probably Corvex with grouping from Containment Wall or maybe the slow on his pillars. If it needs to be more impactful than that, Daggeth's slow or Citrine's Crystallize could count, but those aren't really the main point of the ability. Gyre has CC elements due to the electric status effect, but I'd argue she's more of a Gunzerker type of character than a CC character. Honestly, I'd argue it's Ureli, back in 2021, on account of Riptide and Sea Snares. Though you could absolutely make arguments for or against this being her role, I think she fits the definition the best. So then, that puts nearly 3 years between now and our last CC-focused character, though Ureli still absolutely has stuff like damage vulnerability and the entirety of Surging Blades that make her not bound to CC exclusively. Support characters honestly suffer from this too, to a lesser extent albeit, with Dante being the most recent character to fit the archetype, and the last one we got before him being Citrine at the start of 2023. But look at damage frames. Corvex, Daggeth, Kullervo, Varuna, Styanax, all of them very recent and often in sequence. Hell, even Dante has strong nuking elements from Dark Verse and Tragedy, even if he has support elements as well. Some do have other archetypes tied to them, like Styanax being a pretty good jack of all trades, and Varuna and Kullervo having a melee emphasis, while Corvex and Daggeth are more combo caster type frames, but they all fundamentally excel at killing large quantities of enemies very quickly. The reason for this is that's what the game demands these days, and the devs are well aware of that fact. When presented with the possibility of a Loki rework on Twitter, Pablo said he didn't want to do such a thing because making Loki king again would require that he make him not Loki. The thing I find odd about this is that it both assumes damage is the only way to rework a character viably, and that Loki would need to be king again for his rework to be worth it, both of which are absolutely not true. But honestly, I think a full-blown rework of Loki isn't the answer by itself, as several other frames would be left to gather dust due to the underlying issue of CC neglect and damage emphasis. Should we rework Loki? Yeah, I think so. But I feel like we can absolutely keep his identity as a CC-focused character if we strike at the heart of the issue. So, what can be done about it? Well, considering that I find feedback like this to be somewhat shallow if I don't present any solutions, I want to discuss some ways I think Overguard could be made more fair, as well as balance changes to some other counter mobs that, while not as big of offenders, still deserve to be reined in. This could hopefully improve playstyle diversity in lots of mission types, and make these high Overguard environments not so oppressive. So then, the design purpose of Overguard is to force you to contend with beefy enemies, but that doesn't mean that CC has to do nothing to it. As such, I want to outline a few ideas I have to make it interact with crowd control and not reinforce the existing meta as much. My first suggestion is rather simple and rather popular, but honestly rather lazy, though it does give CC some effect: status reduction. Some enemies, like Kupordons for example, have a mechanic where crowd control effects last for 75% of their normal duration, and subsequent uses reduce that by a further 75% until it gets so low it basically stops working. This could absolutely work, but I find it's far from perfect. High duration CC could still easily lock down an Eximus for long enough to kill them without ever actually contending with their unique mechanic, which violates Overguard's first principle of contending with unique mechanics. It could maybe have a hard cap of like 5 or 10 seconds, but that honestly still feels shoddy to me. My next suggestion then is gonna be rather out there, but I think it has potential. Damaging abilities and AoE attacks deal reduced damage to Overguard, but if a CC ability has affected a unit with Overguard, the damage that Overguard takes goes back up. This could be something like 30 or 50% of the normal ability and AoE damage. The number itself doesn't matter that much, but the idea is to make it so cracking Overguard through damage alone is harder and makes mindless nuking less viable. We deal so much damage in Warframe that it might not even matter, but this will make it harder to pull off so easily at the least, and help CC play into its strength of being a way to set up for damage. Each CC ability would increase the damage taken. Say in the 30% damage example, each CC ability increases the damage Overguard takes by a further 30%, meaning that enough CC will restore full damage and even start to go over the old effectiveness. This makes CC frames more viable against these units, as they make them considerably easier to take down. I know some of you might think I'm just reinforcing the problem of Overguard being more of a health bar than a CC stopgap, but I think that the reason this is a bad thing to begin with is because it reinforces the existing meta, not necessarily being an issue by itself. Abilities and AoE will still likely be able to kill Overguard by themselves, it'll just take more time, meaning they'll again have to contend with the enemy's mechanics. I hate to say it, but Overguard kinda has to be an extra layer of health to achieve its goal, so this is just to tone down things that make it easy and mindless to deal with. You might notice I also never said anything about nerfing single target damage, and that's because I think that those weapons should retain full effectiveness, with each CC ability only ever improving that effectiveness. So you start at 100% damage, and that 30% damage increase from my prior example will just further stack that single target damage from there, which on top of headshots will make these weapons much better at cracking enemies' defenses. To kind of round out this concept, my idea for CC abilities increasing Overguard damage would have a cap, probably at say 4 stacks. This would just be so that in full squads, enemies wouldn't get huge damage boosts to their Overguard from 12 different CC sources hitting them all at once, as this would just reinforce that mindless damage meta by buffing those previously scaled back things beyond even their current power level. This would be 150% damage for abilities and AoE if we stuck with that 30% number, meaning that CC characters won't only keep chaff units at bay, but will also speed up the process for Eximus units being taken down even beyond what a damage frame could do by themselves, all without getting too absurd. For single-target weapons, this increase would scale from 100% as its starting number instead of 30%, resulting in 220% more damage to Overguard. This would reinforce more skill-based mechanics like headshots, while also giving them more purpose. Single targets also generally can't just blow up a whole room, so you would still actually have to contend with an Eximus unit's unique mechanics when engaging them, as you couldn't just mindlessly delete them from the other side of a wall. Add on the aforementioned headshots, dealing so much additional damage, and it really works to cement a more skill-based mechanic into dealing with these enemies. Now, I will confess, this idea has one major flaw. If the damage increase is too high, or too easy to access, it will make Overguard so quick and easy to deal with that it again makes these enemies easy to ignore. Should the player be rewarded for trying hard with the bounty of shutting down Eximus units quickly? Maybe, maybe not. But the point stands that making CC a damage boost can give it the very same issue it had when Pablo playtested these enemies back before the Zeraman. You might not even notice their unique effects as you crack the Overguard too quickly, then casting your CC and never having to actually fight them. Maybe CC granting more damage isn't the answer. Maybe status reduction is the best course of action. Maybe Overguard shouldn't even exist at all. Or maybe, just maybe, we can push CC out of the solution to Overguard entirely in favor of a new mechanic. This idea is honestly really out there, but it's built on the concept presented by a small piece of information I didn't mention earlier. Overguard has no damage matchups, positive or negative, except for Void, which deals 50% more damage to it. This is funny because ants deal fuck all for damage, but I think the idea has promise. So, my suggestion is to either massively increase the amount of damage operators can do to Overguard, make Void procs specifically increase the damage players deal to Overguard, or, more radically, make it so operators can remove Overguard instantly. Maybe this will just be done by hitting them with an amp, maybe by Void slinging through them, but being able to quickly tag in and out of Operator to strip Overguard would bolster that in and out gameplay that DE was trying to build up with Angels, and give players more reason to interact with the system. Considering the 50% increased damage from Void, I do think this was kind of the original idea, but it never really bore fruit, as operators are just so fucking weak. I will say that I don't think this should apply to Zata's Whisper or the Vast Untime, as being able to delete all Overguard with a single 4 or by spamming Zata's infused AoE defeats the purpose of Overguard and why we're even making this change. Remember, this mechanic is to force you to contend with heavy units, so mindless play defeating it is against its principle. Having to use your operator, or even ramping damage with CC abilities like mentioned earlier, requires more intentionality and setup, and as such, adheres to the original intention, as it means players have to either play differently to get rid of them, or gamble a transference static to strip them quickly. As another more general thing, I think Overguard should store crowd control dealt to it, and when it breaks, those effects should bleed over onto the unit possessing it for the remaining duration of the CC ability. This would mean you could throw out your CC, chew through Overguard now that it takes more damage, and once that's done, your CC works as expected. You had to engage the enemy in combat, you had to contend with their unique mechanic, but now that you've eaten up their defenses, I don't see any point in requiring another cast. This is actually how it works on Limbo, where rifted enemies are affected by stasis as soon as their Overguard goes away, and it plays great. Once an Eximus unit has been adequately engaged, they immediately succumb to the crowd control effect, no fuss. Didn't expect Limbo to be taking any W's in today's video, honestly. Needing to recast is especially inconvenient for characters like Neja, who would have to drop all other enemies affected by his CC to scoop up the freshly Overguardless Eximus, so this change should just make it feel a lot better. You could even show the icons for what abilities are in queue above the enemy so the player knows what'll take effect once it drops. I know that none of these solutions are perfect, and I am absolutely no game designer, but these are the best I could come up with that give CC a renewed purpose against Overguard, and shake up the meta while maintaining Overguard's original intent. This doesn't entirely solve spamming these units, and shit like Bolstered Belligerence should absolutely be removed, or at least re-evaluated, but this will help a lot with granting CC purpose in situations where it currently does absolutely nothing. The operator idea is more to reinforce an existing synergy that's just terribly lacking, and while I think it has promise, it isn't one I think is the best solution by itself. If implemented with my other ideas, it could make things too easy, so that's more of an out there pitch I just wanted to bring up as a way to introduce a synergistic X factor of sorts. Lastly, CC abilities affecting units who resisted them once Overguard is gone would just be really nice and improve the overall comfort of playing CC-focused characters. Hell, even if Overguard spam isn't lowered, the idea of CC bleeding over will make it far more manageable. If anything is to be added from these suggestions, please make it this one, as even with none of my other ideas being considered, it would still be hugely useful. Now, Overguard isn't the only thing that works against CC, so for this last part of the video, I want to talk about two other major things that could be changed to help improve the playstyle diversity of Warframe. Other counter mobs like Demolishers and Nullifiers, and mission types that actively discourage the use of crowd control. Considering that we've already talked about them so much already, let's just knock counter mobs out of the way first. First up is the previously mentioned Ancient Healer, who I actually think is pretty easy to fix. My suggestion is just to remove his Overguard mechanic entirely and instead grant rapid health regeneration to nearby enemies, as well as maybe some sort of damage reduction. Why this? Well, because it would open up an interaction. Enemies under these effects might be tough to kill, but can be crowd controlled until you locate and dispatch the Ancient itself. This would also not stop these enemies from being killed, unlike how Overguard stops them from being crowd controlled entirely. It would just make it more difficult. Reducing their frequency and more clearly telegraphing who's linked to them would both still be hugely helpful in this example, but I think the idea of them, well, being a healer, both grants a fun interaction with CC and also stops them from shutting it down entirely in infested missions. Next up is the Nullifier, who fucks over most abilities, but especially crowd control. There are some specific interactions I want to mention, but my first suggestion is pretty simple and similar to the Overguard one. If a Nullifier is affected by a CC ability, it should reduce the size of its bubble, making it shrink like it's taken 1 or 2 hits. I think this should scale down until it's 1 shot from breaking, so you still have to contend with the enemy, but they'll affect less units with their bubble and should be less oppressive. Unlike with the Eximus idea though, repeated casts of the same ability should continue to chip it down until it reaches that final hit. This also helps to balance the playing field with damaging abilities being able to hurt Nully bubbles. With the intent of Nullifiers being to encourage regular weapon usage and put a stop to ability spam, you could argue this hurts the intention of these enemies. Honestly though, I feel like if we're gonna argue that, the only other thing we could do is just make them immune to damage too, and I don't love that solution. We could definitely do that, and I think it's honestly equally as valid as it adds consistency, but it just won't feel as fun to get screwed by these enemies even harder. Nullifiers are also a particularly bullshit enemy for Limbo and Frost, and I want to outline how that could be improved specifically. For Limbo, they currently completely collapse Cataclysm if they touch it, which fucks him over so hard that I honestly think he can't be played with high range in Corpus and Corrupted missions. My solution is to make it so that any enemy under the bubble is unable to be affected by stasis, though they are frozen again if they leave it. This would leave Cataclysm intact while still making Nullifiers a threat. They'd just be much more fair as they won't collapse your rift from the next room over. For Frost, I think contact with a nullifier bubble should start to rapidly damage Snow Globe, but shouldn't destroy it immediately, as this similarly makes high-range bubbles very hard to maintain in missions where nullies are just running amok and trashing the place. The last counter mob I want to discuss is the Demolisher, which I find to be an interesting case. For those who don't know, Demolishers are a mission-critical enemy in the Disruption game mode, but what makes them a counter mob is that every 5 seconds they pulse out a wave 6 meters around them that dispels any active abilities, being both ones players have active on themselves and those affecting the Demolisher itself. They're also outright immune to many CC effects, which I'll show the list of on screen now. Yes, I took this from the wiki. I feel like retyping it would be pointless and is still plagiarism, so at least I'm citing my source. If I ever think my videos are bad, I can at least take solace knowing that I'm better than James Somerton. They can be affected by several CC abilities too, but that constant pulsing makes them escape those effects quickly unless they are constantly applied from a safe distance, like with a high-range Gloom. I find this so weird because Disruption has a timer mechanic where you'll succeed in capturing a conduit if the timer goes to 0, even if its associated Demolisher is left alive. So why then are we forced to play this mode like a big damage check when we have a built-in mechanic that could make CC a viable option? I have absolutely no idea, but we're gonna try to fix it. My suggestion for this is to make it so the pulse frequency is reduced to say every 15 seconds or so, while also broadening what CC abilities can affect the Demolisher. This would mean you still have to contend with the Demolisher, as you can't just sleep them with high duration and then move on, but it would also make CC a much more viable way to stall them out. They also have a cap of 4 cold procs, which could be removed, but I don't think that's needed to be honest. Cold status is still quite effective against them as is, and hitting the full 90% slow effect might actually diminish CC Frame's rolls as it would be so easy to hit on any other character. Even so, this should make CCing demos to stall them out a much more consistent and viable tactic. Not as effective as straight up damage, but it could help you lock demos down while you and your teammates wail on them, or allow you to stall them out if you don't have the DPS potential. Ideally, this should make the absurd damage less of a requirement at higher levels and open up new ways to play the mode. Okay, let's talk about hostile game modes. I outlined several earlier, but I honestly think there are only a few really big offenders. While certain modes like Survival and Exterminate aren't helped out that much by CC, they aren't necessarily hurt by it either, so I leave them mostly alone. While CC may not explicitly progress the objective in these modes, it still does serve its purpose of making situations more manageable and setting up for other attacks. Instead, I want to focus on modes which really fuck it over, and with Disruption out of the way, let's get into a few others. First, let's start with Netracells. The fact that you have to kill enemies in such a small radius makes CC actively slow the pace of the mission to a crawl, as many abilities and even status effects will cause enemies to just post up right outside the ring, like a group of protesters trying not to trespass. My suggestion for this is simple. Double, or maybe even triple, the size of the ring. This would make most enemy spawns occur inside of the ring, so while you still have to play in the same room, it won't be nearly as annoying, and will help CC serve its purpose of limiting enemies instead of making the mission take 20 fucking minutes. Next up is Void Armageddon, which is an issue because enemies can still damage things that aren't currently under attack, so if you leave enemies alive in a specific area, they'll just trash the objective while you're trying to defend the other one. I think this one is also simple. When a wave ends, anything that isn't your current objective should become invincible, and all living enemies should be redirected to the new current objective. This means that if you get too far away from them, they'll just be teleported to the other Exodamper, which is actually an existing mechanic already. If this was implemented to Armageddon, and objectives were made invincible if they're not the target to prevent enemies from destroying them if left alive, it would improve the viability of CC considerably. For defense, I'm going to propose a pretty radical change. Instead of being a wave-based mode, defense should be a time-based mode like Survival. Enemies will now constantly spawn and attack the objective, and at the 5-minute mark, you'll be given the option to extract. I know some of you will say this is a big nerf to rewards in defense, as you can complete rotations faster than 5 minutes, but I'd argue otherwise. In Steel Path and just generally in later waves, the enemy spawns are so numerous that doing a wave a minute is very challenging, especially solo. I know many people outright skip arbitrations or incursions that roll on nodes with this game mode because they're often so time-consuming, and more importantly, they're inconsistent. When I play Survival, I know I'll be getting a reward every 5 minutes, whereas in Defense, it can take anywhere from a few minutes to a dozen depending on my squad's effectiveness. This change would improve Defense's consistency, which would make it feel more rewarding, and on top of that, it would renew focus on, actually defending the objective, instead of slaughtering enemies as fast as possible. Mirror and mobile defense prove this concept can and does work, and I think it's due time to bring it over into their mother game mode. With it being so core to Warframe, I think it would improve a lot of areas of the game all at once if it were to be changed to be like this. Another game mode I should probably bring up is Capture. Capture targets can't be affected by pretty much any form of CC, which I find really odd. They're even immune to cold procs, which is kinda extreme if you ask me. This game mode seems like a perfect opportunity to let CC shine, and it doesn't for no real reason, so I think these effects should apply to capture targets. On top of that, please let us sneak up on capture targets to make stealth a viable route for these missions too. ESO is, well, a tough nut to crack. With how it's designed, I genuinely don't know how to make CC an appealing option there without changing the game mode completely. My only real suggestions are maybe CC'd enemies could grant more efficiency when killed, or that maybe enemies being CC'd would slow the timer drain, but I'll admit I haven't been able to find a perfect answer. I'm just gonna throw this out there and see how it's analyzed, though if I could choose, CC'd enemies granting more efficiency I think is a decent compromise. You could honestly even extend this to survival, making enemies have a higher chance to drop life support if CC'd, but I don't think that's as necessary. Looking over every other game mode, I don't think that there are any that really fuck CC over beyond that, at least not on the same level as the others we've outlined. It sometimes isn't specifically helpful to the objective, like in Void Flood or Exterminate, but it does still have the innate benefit of stalling enemies, which I do think is enough. Other game modes like Interception and Hijack encourage its use, which is ideal, but I don't think every single mode needs to bend over backwards to cater to crowd control. It should just be a viable option that at the least doesn't actively harm your ability to do the objective. I do very much think that future modes should be designed with it in mind, but certain older modes will become overly complicated or need very radical changes to suit it when it's already able to do its job. It's just not specifically useful for completing that particular objective. Void Cascade will also get better if the Overguard changes I requested are implemented, so I'm gonna gloss over it, though maybe you could increase the Exilizer radius so killing enemies near it is easier. I also think bosses not being affected by crowd control is actually generally okay, as most boss fights contain fodder enemies which can be crowd controlled, which keeps pressure off of damage dealers and helps your team focus on the boss. You know, the whole purpose of crowd control. Now that we're through 18 pages of this script, and probably almost an hour of video, I've gotten most of my ideas out, so I want to summarize my thoughts. Overguard is a mechanic that's supposed to force players to deal with powerful special units, being balanced by the scarcity and counterability of these units. Problem is, it's become so common and used on so many unfitting enemies at higher levels that it's effectively become a blanket nerf to CC in the name of difficulty. In my view, the prevalence of Overguard should be scaled back to fit with its original vision, and crowd control effects should interact with Overguard in a way that makes CC rewarding without violating Overguard's original vision. On top of that, other oppressive counter units should be given more interaction with crowd control effects, and hostile game mode design should be altered to allow CC to at least not be the equivalent of fracturing your femur. With all of that out of the way, I want to say again that I don't think CC is totally dead in the current state of the game, and I still find that to be a very absolutist position to take on it. Regardless of that fact, it has issues that should be addressed, and I hope that this video has outlined why those issues exist, what makes them issues to begin with, and how we can go about fixing them. I also want to clarify that I don't think these changes will make CC better than damage, and I really don't even think that's a good idea. If crowd control was as powerful as damage, then you could just spam things like Radial Blind and Stomp and hardly play the game as everything would be a glorified practice dummy. This conversation is often framed as comparing CC directly to damage, but CC's purpose isn't the same as damage is. I know I said this all earlier, but as a reminder, crowd control, well, keeps enemies under control. Put simply, I think CC should be a complement to damage, not a direct competitor, opening up enemies to attacks while preventing them from counter-attacking. Warframe is a horde shooter into power fantasy. Dealing lots of damage to lots of stuff is core to that identity. The problem isn't that CC can't do what damage does, it's just that damage currently doesn't need its help. Many enemies ignore CC, and several game modes are made harder by its use, while damage is always helpful in every case. With all the stuff I've outlined, hopefully we can make CC's effects more desirable and consistently useful, while still allowing damage to give us that power level we've all come to enjoy. The goal is to open up new playstyles instead of just creating a new meta where CC is on top while other things suffer because of the same implementation issues that handicapped CC to begin with. Heck, maybe we'll even see a frame with a crowd control focus released someday, but that's admittedly wishful thinking. This whole video, really, has been an open letter to DE themselves, getting out my thoughts on how to improve their game that I'm so passionate about and enjoy so much after 10 years of playing. This section, however, is dedicated to the Warframe community at large, so allow me to get up on my high horse for a second as I let out something I've held back since the times of the Zeraman. Whenever we collectively engage in discussions like this one, about balance and game design, it seems like people's ability to be rational and level-headed gets thrown completely out the window. So many people are saying that CC is totally worthless and the developers are incompetent and all things of that stripe, which I find to be a pretty extreme position to say the least. In the same vein, the amount of vitriol and toxicity I see whenever anything controversial is brought up, like Overguard or even more recently the nerfs to Dante, is absolutely absurd and entirely unacceptable. People are often so quick to immediately take the most extreme possible position and bully anyone who disagrees without hearing them out. This seems to happen in any community discourse, defaulting to groupthink and rejecting any dissenting view. I know this happens in any game community, but it's really bad in this one. This affected me directly, constantly when I would stream the game after Angels was new, as people would accuse me of being part of the problem for playing the game on a channel about Warframe. Can you guys really blame me for hating the Warframe subreddit? Some people have argued the devs should know not to kick the hornet's nest, but I find that to be a very victim-blamey mentality. Ask yourself, do you honestly think that the devs make changes to the game with the intent of making the game worse? Of course not, that's just logically absurd. Why would you deliberately drive players away from your game by making choices that you know are against their wants and interests? On top of that, DE very often implements changes based on feedback and requests, like the recent cloak cosmetic options, and is usually very receptive to community discussion. Issue is, when that discussion is so caustic and emotionally charged, parsing the genuine criticism from the schizoid ranting becomes very difficult. What I want to say is that everyone who partakes in this behavior is childish and rash and has no critical thinking skills, but I completely understand that sometimes you're just frustrated and confused. I mean, I get that way too, especially when I'm on my 4th hour of trying to solo a deep Archemedea just to lose my run to yet another bullshit modifier. What I will say then is to just please have some empathy. Dev bashing is not constructive, melting down over changes and being toxic instead of providing good quality feedback is counterproductive, and lashing out at other players who have differing opinions makes the community as a whole a less fun place. And after all, isn't the whole point of playing and talking about video games to have fun? Not if you're me, baby, this game is like a second job. Woo! Okay, with all my DE meat writing out of the way, that's all I've got to say. Thank you so much if you've made it this far. This project ballooned into something much larger and more complex than I originally intended, but it's honestly cathartic to have my thoughts out there after keeping them in and letting them develop for so long. This was originally much shorter, but the more I thought about the topic, the more I wanted to say, and now we're here, at the end of one of my channel's longest and probably most schizophrenic videos. I don't really think this is going to have any actual change on the game. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I hope at the least that we can get enough attention on this issue that something happens. Regardless of all that, remember to like, sub, join the Discord, watch the streams, all that nonsense, and do comment with any ideas you have about this topic. I do ask that you try to be level-headed. My footnote about toxicity still absolutely applies down there, so please be civil, but I do want this to be an open discussion. I also don't really expect this video to do that well, so if you want to support me in the stuff I make on this channel, feel free to become a member, which gives you some fun perks like early access to videos and whatnot. I don't know, you can click the join button and read the specifics. Huge thank you to all my current members, whose names are now on my all-new member whiteboard, which makes me feel like an e-thought on Twitch, but I don't know, I thought it would be funny. With all of that out of the way, thanks again for watching, thanks again to my members, and I'll see you all next time when we talk about the only other playstyle fucked over worse than crowd control, stealth. I'm tweaking the fuck. I can't throw the Orbeus. What do I do? I can't progress in the boss fight. What do I do?